And I'm back. And new subscribers or relatively new subscribers to Jazz on the Tube may wonder, where's the music? Well, look, you can go to the homepage 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You can go to the video vault and see there's more music there than you could watch in a lifetime. It's all indexed. You can look up things by song. You can look up things by artist. You'll never get to the bottom of it. But this week, we are doing something special, which is we are promoting the very first Jazz on the Tube book. It's called Death, Resurrection, and the Spirit of New Orleans. And it was inspired by the time I spent in New Orleans between early 2006 and 2010. And for people that don't remember or are too young to know, New Orleans was wiped out in 2005. When I say wiped out, I mean hundreds of thousands of people homeless, not a couple of hundred or 1,000 or 10,000 or 50, hundreds of thousands. All the businesses were closed. All the schools were closed. All the churches were closed. All the homes, most of the homes were evacuated. Many of them were still deep underwater and remained underwater for up to a month. I mean, it was a wipeout. Street lights didn't work. The traffic lights didn't work. There was no power. It's not good to be in New Orleans without electricity in September, believe me. Water lines broken, sewer lines broken. I mean, it was like war, right? Without the fighting. And yet it came back. It's one of the great comeback stories of all time. And this book is about how it came back. And, a lot of people think that music and musicians are, a sort of secondary part of life, and we can live with them, without them. It doesn't really matter. Well, when push comes to shove and spiritual energy is needed, it comes from our musicians. And never was that truer than in the case of New Orleans. The musicians and all the people behind them, the fans, and producers, and even the waiters, waitresses, busboys, dishwashers, cooks, venue owners. It was the music that was the engine that rebuilt the city, especially in the early days, because things were grim. And so that's what this book is about. And it was a very difficult time, but it was a very inspiring time, and music led the way. So I wanted to make sure that this story was documented. It's the first of our Jazz on the Tube books. We're looking forward to many more. I want to thank all of our supporters. The reason I had the time and then also the money to hire people to help me, because I needed help with a lot of things, is because of Jazz on the Tube supporters. So I'm really appreciative of that. And I hope you find it's money well spent. I want to go into the book and tell you what's in it. First, I talk about how I got involved in New Orleans, how I discovered New Orleans for myself, how ignorant I had been. And that's one of the big motivations for me writing this book. I was very ignorant about the depth and breadth of modern day, today, New Orleans. I, grew up in New York City. I passed through New Orleans once on my way out west. I didn't really get it because I wasn't there long enough to learn anything. I always had the idea, well, there's Bourbon Street and there's Dixieland Jazz, and it's used to be a big deal, but who knows what's going on there now. I mean, very ignorant viewpoint, but shared by a whole lot of people. And when I finally got to New Orleans and spent the time there, and every year between 2006 and 2010, 2011, I would spend anywhere from 3 to 5 months of my year there involved in various projects. So, and of course, I'm a music lover, and I'm a guy that researches stuff, and, I get into things. And I learned a lot of things about New Orleans. In fact, I constantly surprise New Orleans natives with things that they didn't know about their own city. And I guarantee we have a lot of great musicians out there, professional musicians and serious music students, who don't know their ABCs in New Orleans. So that's the reason this book is here. Not the ancient history of New Orleans of the modern era, which before the flood, of course, and after the flood. Don't forget, a lot of music came out of New Orleans, not just jazz, not just traditional jazz. Right now, there's sort of a renaissance of brass band music. There's brass bands all over the world, they all descend from the New Orleans brass bands, in particular the Dirty Dozen brass band. There was a tradition of brass band music in New Orleans for funerals, for parties, spiritual, a lot of them were spiritual tunes. But it was one group, right? The Dirty Dozen brass band that said, well, let's use the brass band format to play Ellington and Count Basie, and even Charlie Parker. And so, and now it's anything goes, if you can pull it off musically, you can do it in the brass band format. And that has taken the world by fire, like fire. We have one of the innovators of that in the book. His name's Roger Lewis. And when I interviewed Roger, he was, I don't know, I don't have it here handy, but I think he was 79 years old. So that was a couple of years ago. So he grew up in New Orleans in the 40s. He was a child child in the 40s. And so and then he grew up and he became a musician and he was gigging and, he knew the whole scene of New Orleans music in the late 40s but more in the 50s and 60s as he was coming up as a musician. And that's a missing chapter in New Orleans music history. And it really shouldn't be, because a lot of great music was happening then. I'll give you an example, and I mentioned this in the last call. When John Coltrane came to New Orleans on a gig, he wanted to go and hear a particular saxophone player. That's what he wanted to do when he was in New Orleans, because there are a lot of great players in New Orleans that just never got out of town. Why not? Well, to become famous or to have a national or international profile, you have to tour a lot. And, touring may seem glamorous from the outside, but basically it's being away from home. I mean, would you really like a job where you're away from home 30 to 40 to 50 weeks a year? That's hard going, and that's the only way you're going to get famous. You're not going to get famous staying home. But a lot of New Orleans musicians, there were so many opportunities to play, so many creative opportunities to satisfy their desire to play music. A lot of some of the greatest musicians in New Orleans history never left or barely left. And so Roger gets into that, names the names, and he also talks about the lower Ninth Ward, so famous, everybody's heard of it, but why was it so famous? And he gets into it, all the backyard nightclubs and how much music there was there. Really interesting chapter. Then we've got a chapter with Ronald Lewis, who's not related to Roger Lewis, and he's not a musician, but he's he was a community leader and a cultural leader as well. He was a Mardi Gras Indian. He was a president of I believe it was the Big Nine Social and Pleasure Club, which these are two things that are New Orleans secret weapons: the Mardi Gras Indians, of which there are many tribes, and the social and pleasure clubs, of which there are many. Mardi Gras Indians goes back to the time, it's a living memory of the time when Native Americans and African Americans partnered, worked together, ran off together, fought back together, made music together. This is a really important part of American history that's been sort of like erased, but it is a big deal. In fact, in many ways, that cultural union is one of the major cultural streams in the American character, and it's alive and well in New Orleans, and it's embodied in the Mardi Gras Indian culture. And we get into that with Mr. Lewis, because he was a Mardi Gras Indian, which involves the hand making, no machines involved, of these elaborate suits. You make a beautiful suit that you can only wear that year for the events of that year. And then when the year's over, you kind of make another one. It's not like jazz, right? You can't play the same solo every time you get up there. That'd be ridiculous. And they, in the old days, they used to only come out on Mardi Gras morning, and they would also come out on St. Joseph's Day, which interestingly enough is a Catholic saint day, a saint beloved by the Sicilians. And what a lot of people don't know, this is a bit of a sidebar, we don't really get into it in the book that much, but at the turn of the last century, 1900, the French Quarter was 90% Sicilians. There were a lot of Sicilian people in New Orleans, and they brought their brass band tradition to New Orleans, and it got mixed in with everything else. All those, have you ever seen the guys with the hats and they're wearing like little uniforms? That's a Sicilian thing. Okay. And it was adopted by the African-American musicians too, because it's cool. And notice that when the Mardi Gras Indians come out, they come out on an Italian Saints Day. That's really interesting. Someday we'll go into that in great depth. Everybody likes to, or not everybody, but the big buzzword by people who don't even know what it means, diversity. That's been going on forever, and it's alive and well in New Orleans. A true mixing of culture, and Mr. Lewis gets into it in great depth. In fact, one of the things we have in the book is a piece of his artwork. If I can find it, let me see. Here's the book. You can see I'm looking through the book. It's been a long day here at Jazz. There we go. Hand stitched. Those are beads. And that's just one little part of his costume, right? And no machines involved. Everything's handmade. So that's one of the secret weapons of New Orleans. Mardi Gras Indians have a music which they didn't perform for the public. They would play in private. They would rehearse in private, and they would come out on Mardi Gras Day and on St. Joseph's Day. In the 70s, it started to become a performance thing as well. So you can actually go and hear performances of the Mardi Gras Indians, various tribes, but that's new. That's relatively new. Then you have the social and pleasure clubs, and those are descendants of the old benevolent societies. And those were, a coming together of people. They would pay their dues. There would be a big fund that the group would have. And then when a member needed money, sometimes for burial of a loved one, there'd be a fund available. It was like, homegrown insurance. Now that's not needed anymore. So they're not benevolent societies anymore. They're social and pleasure clubs. Social in that they do good things, pleasure in that they like to have a big party. So there's, I don't know, dozens of these groups in New Orleans. And they have each one of them has a big annual party where they raise a lot of money, and then they have dues, and then they have their annual parade. And that's the other thing that's so amazing about this city. There's a parade every week, at least, various sizes. And in the parade season, which is from January 6th all the way to Mardi Gras, I mean, there's countless. I mean, literally, you'd have trouble counting them all. Large, small, medium size. During the final week, from the Sunday before the Sunday of Mardi Gras, and up to Mardi Gras that weekend, and then Lundi Gras, there are at least 40, maybe 50 major parades, right? And then many, 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 many minor parades. And then some people will just start their own parade. 3 guys, a drum and a saxophone and a singer will just have their own parade, So it's got this live music tradition. Music is part of life in New Orleans to a degree that it doesn't exist in any other city that in the United States. You just don't see it anymore. Used to be the norm in America, but now we're modern and, we don't have that. So New Orleans is holding on to that beautiful, beautiful tradition. So that is another one of New Orleans's secret weapons. And in our interview with Ronald Lewis, we get into that culture deep. Who else do we talk to? Well, we talk with John Swenson, a writer. John's passed away now. He was a great rock and roll writer of the 1960s and 70s, and then he fell in love with New Orleans and became a chronicler of life in New Orleans. He wrote a beautiful book, called the New Atlantis, where he documented in great detail specifically how the musicians of New Orleans were the key in bringing the city back. And so he and I had an extended conversation. When did we do that? Way back, 2011. And we, I had my input, he had his input. And now here's the thing that's interesting about this book is when Roger Lewis was when I interviewed Roger Lewis, and when Chuck Perkins interviewed Ronald Lewis, the Mardi Gras Indian and community leader, and when I interviewed John Swenson, it just so happened that they would refer to things, especially around the post-flood era, that I had videotaped or had made films about. So in the book, not only do you have the text to learn from, every single chapter points to specific videos. So if you're like curious about, gee, I wonder what that was like, you don't have to be curious. You can go to our website and, you know, type in the page, and you're going to see exactly what we're talking about. You know, what was that event? Well, it's on video. It's just, I just happened to be everywhere with a camera in those days. And it just worked out that way. So not only do you get the text, you get the references to all the video. What I want to say, and there's another thing in here. Everyone is kind of aware of the great musicians that were born and bred in New Orleans and raised up and then went out on the world. The Ellis family, Louis Armstrong, for example. But they're not aware of all the musicians who had major personal and artistic breakthroughs in New Orleans. Okay. Or for instance, you don't think of Lester Young as a New Orleans guy. But as a young boy, he lived in either in Algiers or New Orleans. There's some debate about that, but Algiers just right across the river from New Orleans. But in his recollections of life, when he would tell people about his childhood, you know, he'd hear a parade, because there were always a lot of parades in New Orleans, and he'd just run along with the parade and groove on the music, you know, and that had an impact on him. Who else was influenced by New Orleans? And it's a long list. Ray Charles. Ray Charles was not Ray Charles until he came to New Orleans and spent a long time at a place called the Dewdrop Inn, performing and checking out the local music and working with local musicians. Even Motown, you know, a lot of the Motown sound, especially after the early 60s, started in the late 50s, but then, you know, they got rolling in the 60s, was kind of sparked by a New Orleans drummer that came up and did some session work up there. He did some recording. And he was a guy named Smokey Robinson, and he's a great New Orleans drummer. And New Orleans drummers are different; they are different. Think of Ed Blackwell; they have a lot going on, and he had a major influence on how Motown approached the drums. Who else was influenced by New Orleans? Even people like Emily Remler, the great guitarist, you know, who died so young. Still one of my favorite musicians still to this day. She was polished her chops in New Orleans. She graduated from Berkeley. She spent a little time in New York City, and she went down to New Orleans and gigged and played with all the cats down there. And then she came back to New York, and she was on fire. Who else? Oh, that's the thing I have in this book that's so unique. Ornette Coleman. You would not think of Ornette Coleman as a New Orleans guy unless you knew the real story. So grew up in Fort Worth, and toured, you know, as a teenager, and found himself stranded in New Orleans, stayed with the Lasty family, a great musical family. That's the other thing about New Orleans, you know, the musical families, right? The Neville family, the Lasty family that you might not know, but the Andrews family, the Ellis family, the Baptiste family. There are a lot of family musical dynasties in that one city, and it's a good thing, right? The Bachs had Johann Bach had children that were great composers, and you know, Mozart was taught by his dad, and it helps if your family's in the business. You know, you get an early start, and New Orleans has a lot of those people. Anyway, at age 19, which is a very formidable time in a person's life, Ornette found himself stranded, basically, in New Orleans. The Lasties took him in, and he says, it's in the book, that's where he had an idea for playing free and did it on his own, but that's where he did it with other people, and where he felt that, wow, I can actually play this way, and I'll find an audience, or I'll find musical colleagues. And he says it in the book. And this is another case of where not only do we have it in the book, I have the actual conversation I had with him where I recorded it. He was 77 at the time. We recorded it in 2007. And, you know, I asked him some questions. I just asked him, you know, and he and I were friends. He from 1980 till he passed, we were good friends. I'd see him maybe once a year when I came to the city. I'd always call him up, and if more, it's always seemed to work out that he happened to be free, you know, and we were able to hang out. So I never recorded a conversation with him, but I did record this one with, you know, sort of with his permission. I'm glad I did it. He had a major, major, major personal and artistic breakthrough in New Orleans. So New Orleans is very, very deep. And deeper, I think, than any of us will ever be able to know. And I'm even including people born and bred in New Orleans and spend their whole lives there. And there are a lot of musicians, professional musicians, student musicians, that don't know the full story of New Orleans. And I would say that if you're a musician, you should pay a pilgrimage to that city and spend some time there and just soak up as much of the vibe as you possibly can, because it is one of the well springs of musical creativity, not only for America, but on the planet. And I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about ancient history. Right now, it still is. And this book, if you read it, will give you the guideline, you know, what to look for, you know, what to know, you know, that's down there in the city. Now, some of you are New Orleans experts, and you're like, I don't know, this guy doesn't know anything about what he's talking about. All right, I want to show you something. Okay. Now, if you really know New Orleans, you know who those guys are. Okay. And one of them was me, by the way. I happened to be it was a party, it was a birthday party, it was the 80th birthday party for one of those musicians. I'm not going to tell you who they are. You're going to have to get the book. Some very profoundly important American musicians. One of them may be one of the top 3 vocalists in modern American history. If you ever heard his voice, you'll never forget it. And another guy he was called the Creole Beethoven. He created a lot of the sound of popular music that we learned to love in the 1950s and 60s, his arrangements. And so this book, I know a lot of people who know New Orleans think they know it all. Were you invited to the 80th birthday party of Wardell on his 80th birthday? So I got into it. I got deep into it. But it's not a book for specialists. It's not a book for snobs. It's a book for people that are curious and interested in human creativity in general, and the special creativity of the culture of New Orleans. So whether you've never been to New Orleans and are thinking of going, or you've been sometimes casually, even if you're somebody who's gone to Jazz Fest all the time, you're going to learn a ton from this book that you didn't know. It's going to increase your appreciation of the city, and hopefully it will make you into what I hope I am, which is an ambassador for New Orleans. It's our great, great musical city, and it deserves a ton of appreciation and understanding. So here's the book. Whoops. Here's the book. I ask you to consider getting it. If you get it and like it, consider reviewing it, giving us a positive review on Amazon. That helps. What else can you do to help? Oh, if you know any reviewers, or if you're a reviewer and can prove that your reviews are published, drop me a line, and I may send you a review copy. There's a lot of media out there, right? Jazz radio stations and all this kind of stuff. I'd love to talk about the book but mostly about New Orleans. The reason for the book is New Orleans, right? That's the star of the book. That's why the book was written. And the mission is to make sure that everybody that loves this music understands that it's alive and well and thriving in New Orleans right now. And there's a beautiful, beautiful culture down there. So here's the cover of the book again. I'll show the famous musicians. Oops. And it did focus before. Let me see. Oh, well. But if you know your New Orleans, you know who those guys are, or you know who some of them are at least. So this is a serious book, but a fun book to read too. So it's deep and enjoyable at the same time. I don't think I have anything else to say about the book other than to thank all Jazz on the Tube supporters. This bought me the free time to put this book together. It also bought me the ability to hire people because I don't know how to make covers. I don't know how to lay books out. I'm not a very good proofreader, I'll tell you that. We had volunteers, by the way, to help with that. Thank you guys for that. You made this book possible. It's a Jazz on the Tube book. It's our book. So I hope you'll consider supporting it on that basis as well. All right. Thanks a lot. Take care, and let the good times roll. Oops, we got a postscript. I actually had to record that 3 times. The first 2 times I recorded it, the microphone failed. So I'm a little punch drunk. So it's Smokey Johnson, by the way, the drummer's name. It's not Smokey Robinson. And the other thing is I wanted to go out with some music. And one of the people that we talk about a lot in this book is a young man. I guess he's not, well, we all started out as young men, and then we get older, Glenn David Andrews. And he certainly was a young man at the time of the post flooding disaster. He was the first guy back. He came back before it was legal. He came back before there were electric lights. He came back before there was electricity. And he was gigging, figuring it out. So I actually have a video of him doing, with some friends, doing a jam out, because a lot of the places people played post-flood were weird because the normal places were closed. So this was a jam in the parking lot of a church. That's where the venue was. And I can't really tell you what kind of music this is. It's not jazz. It's not funk. It's not rock. It's not rhythm and blues. It's not soul. It's just music, and it's very powerful. And this was the expression that was happening that day amongst those guys in the early days, because the city really didn't start to even begin to look like its old self even as late as 2009, 2010. So even though this wasn't immediately after the flood, it was still in the era of when things were rough. And so I'm going to go out on this, and I hope you enjoy it. It's got a lot of energy. It's got a lot of energy. Well,